All right, while Phil is getting set up, I'll just go ahead and start introducing Mark and Jim, and then we'll do Phil's introduction when he hops on. Thank you for joining us for our ESOP webinar today. We did the basics of an ESOP on our last month, and this one we are covering kind of the process of converting to an ESOP. So today we've got, again, Jim Van Fleet and Mark Stevens joining us. Thanks, guys, for coming back. And if you missed the first one, just so you know, so Jim Van Fleet has been in the industry since 1993, and his company, Mainly Tubs, he converted it to an ESOP in December of 2016. And he serves on the company's board now and has 7 stores across 4 states. Hi, Phil. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, how you guys doing?
We're just getting our introductions going here. So, so Mark Stevens, he opened Georgia Spa Company in 2004, and in 2023 they converted to an ESOP. And Mark is also on the board. And then our newcomer. Do you prefer Philip or Phil? I didn't get to ask you beforehand.
No worries, Philip's fine.
Okay, all right. So Philip Hayes, he is he's known as the ESOP guy, and he actually is the one who helped Georgia Spa Company become an ESOP. He's a succession planning partner at Berman Hopkins CPAs and Associates, and he hosts the Journey to an ESOP and Beyond podcast. So we have got the ESOP expert with us today. So thank you guys all for coming on. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So Philip has a great outline of all the steps that are needed for an ESOP that I will show you guys here in a minute. But before we get into that, Mark, how did you get connected with Philip in the first place?
I don't know, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I guess, maybe 3 years ago now.
Maybe
Jim
3,
Van Fleet had confused me so bad with understanding ESOPs that I felt like I had to go somewhere and get better knowledge. I had to become educated. And, you know, because I didn't want to let Jim know that I didn't understand his ESOP speak. So I cheated and went to a couple of conferences. And at one of those conferences, I was standing out in the hallway talking, and me and Philip got to speaking and just really connected and realized, hey, if I want to get through this process, I need a quarterback, and I felt like he'd be a good quarterback for us.
Yeah. Yeah. So Philip, obviously you are a big believer in ESOPs. Before we get too deep in the weeds on all of the steps, I mean, how did you get involved in this, and why is this something that you're kind of passionate about?
That's a good question. And so my background is I started in commercial banking a long time ago, and then I transitioned into a CPA firm environment. I'm not a CPA, so I was kind of always the oddball in the group, but it actually worked really well for our firm, which is just another business, right? And so I had finished my MBA, and I had gotten a CVA, which is a valuation credential. And really what happened in my career is I kind of went towards the strategic side of things. So I was the CEO for about 10 years of the firm. And meanwhile, I was doing some succession planning. We as a firm had been very involved with ESOP since 1985. And so it kind of I just gravitated towards that from a lot of succession planning type of consulting. What really resonated to me about the ESOPs was we had so many clients, because we have a lot of middle market types of clients that had, of course, the option to sell to, a third party strategic buyer, private equity, whatever. And I just saw a lot of those deals kind of blow up either before they close or even afterwards. It just wasn't what people really thought they were going to be. And so as I learned more and more about ESOPs, I realized that it's such a good option for people, for a lot of people. But what I saw was just a lack of maybe education, which I think is what we're doing today, right? And what we do with the podcast. The more people understand this, I think the better they look at that, and at least can make a better business decision when it comes to their end game and what they're going to do with their companies.
Yeah. Well, like Mark said, I think that the process seems daunting to people. And I think one of the things you say about your tagline is that you're trying to kind of debunk that myth that it's complicated and hard to understand and hard to do. So let's let's jump into the process a little bit here. Philip had sent over this lovely, can you see that? He sent over this lovely graphic that shows the ESOP process. And I sent this to Mark and Jim beforehand. So I'm curious, did you guys, when you looked at this, did you feel like you went through every single one of those steps in order?
Yes.
How about you, Jim?
Probably because Philip kept you on the discipline, having authored the. I looked at it and I asked Mark if he actually decided to go ahead after he saw that chart.
Yeah.
Because it looks, I think it looks more complex than it really is. I think the important takeaway from me just seeing this for the first time is it is an iterative, step-by-step process over which you have significant control all the way through. And the timing is entirely yours as a business owner. And so while it's got a lot of steps and each of them have their own particular discussion points, but nevertheless, it's a controllable event. And this guideline here, this step process, keeps you on a rigor to get to a finish line, which is what I like about it. I've never met Philip before, so I have no experience with this, but so I hope you don't take that disrespectfully, but I think it makes sense. Yeah.
And I would say that too. When I first saw it, I thought it was a little daunting, but as we work through it, I think as Phil can probably attest to, is I was a little wanting to move some things quicker or do things down the line, and Phil kept having to pull the reins back on me a little bit and say, hey, we get to that in a little bit. We're working on this right now, then we'll work on the next step. And I think that keeps us, as you're moving through the process, it keeps you focused on what you should be working on at that particular time, and not try to bite off too much and move down the process. Just keep the process in mind that you all get to an end by completing those tasks over whatever period you want to do it.
I think as business owners and entrepreneurs, we tend to do that. We're always looking to the next thing and ready to jump forward and move. Like that's just kind of what's built into us on how we work. And so, yeah, it's good to have those people to keep us in line, not just for an ESOP, but for a lot of things in our businesses.
Megan, my own perspective is that each of those steps, I think it's maybe if you want to keep it up there for a minute, I think people who are considering this should know that if you get through the feasibility model and there's certain things that you're learning that you feel you want to fix or repair, or it might not be quite the proper time, but you haven't lost ground. You've merely stepped into a place where you know enough to put together better information or to put in a new procedure or something. So along the way, you can adjust and modify. A couple of these steps I went through very fast, but a couple of them I went pretty slow.
Yeah. I mean, Philip, what's the timeline usually look like? And then we'll get into we'll kind of talk through these steps.
Sure, absolutely. I would say in general, we talk about this 10-step process. First off, it's about 6 months from beginning to end, assuming that everything is going, towards there's availability of the people that you're working with, right? Or if there's not something you run into, like I didn't know that was going to happen. Part of this is to illustrate what is going to happen, so people aren't like, I didn't know we were going to have to do that. And then, so a lot of this is creating an efficiency and an education. Meanwhile, working through everything that we do in each of these steps is going to basically be used in the process as we go. The very first 2 steps, I would say it's about a month and a half. So I'd say about 3 weeks for the valuation model, 3 weeks for the feasibility model. And you see in the ESOP industry, a lot of times the valuation model and the feasibility model are one step for a lot of these companies that do advisory work. I purposely break those in 2 pieces. And the reason is because there's some assumptions and there's some specifics that we want to really nail down in the valuation model that I think in our industry are very much can be assumed. And when I say that, I mean, everybody basically gets to, hey, what's your multiple of EBITDA? As opposed to, hey, really, let's dig into your forecast and talk about what's changing your business over the next 5 years, which is going to gravitate to a discounted cash flow model. And then out of that, there's going to be the discussion about normalized cash flow. So there's a lot of things in there in that very first step that are going to basically help us to work with the client, collaborate around assumptions. And if I came in with a multiple of EBITDA, then I haven't done that. I haven't done my job to really guide the client towards that. So that needs to be done, I think, comprehensively, so that when you do feasibility, you actually have a lot of understanding of what we're trying to accomplish with feasibility. I've reviewed a lot of different advisors' PowerPoints and what other firms are doing. And I will tell you, it's usually some kind of PowerPoint. These are models that you can basically use as business planning tools that help us to create different scenarios. For instance, maybe it's 100% ESOP, maybe it's a partial, maybe it's an S Corp, maybe it's a C Corp. And there's so many different nuances to a lot of those different strategies. The planning models that we're creating in step 1 and 2 are going to lead to questions the client doesn't even know to ask even before they even hire us. And so we're proving out those concepts together collaboratively, and we're getting really prepared to do other things. So that the first thing I would just say about the model and timing is it does need to kind of build around what Jim said around the client's timeline and how that's going to work. But can I do it less than 6 months? Yeah, I've done it before. But most of the time it takes more than that, just because there's a lot of back and forth on shaping the ESOP with the client around what their goals and objectives are.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not probably a process that you want to rush. I think you need to feel comfortable in your decisions.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I would say to that point, steps 1 and 2 are very important because it's new to a lot of business owners, these models and these feasibility and the way that the modeling occurs. That you've got to understand every part of that process and the modeling, because it does affect a lot of things down the road. So, if you go into it and you just agree with everything that the consultant is telling you, then nobody's talking about it, steps, 7, 8, 9 that you should have understood in step probably 1 and 2. So there's a lot of things in the feasibility and the valuation model that need to be worked through and understood by everybody involved in it, so it can move forward. You want to make sure you're 100% knowledgeable of steps 1 and 2 before you move to 3. Before you move, you just want to make sure all that's encompassed before you start moving forward.
I think it's also important just before steps 1 and 2 are to ensure, and Mark, we talked about this a little bit, and Mark was really he'd owned his own company before. He was incredibly astute financially, and he had built, his financial model was together, and happily so is mine. I spent a lot of time getting my financial house in order before I stepped into the valuation model. And so that meant that I had not just a history of budget and actual and cash flows, but I also had future projections. Those things are paramount to this. And if you're not thinking in those terms, then I would suggest that the health of your organization is going to improve once you start thinking in those terms. And that's going to set you up to be in a better position to get whatever value might be there for your company.
So what does the valuation model look like, Philip?
Yeah, and again, coming back to it's partly a collaborative process to create with the client, but it's going to veer towards income approach method. And the income approach method is primarily driven around cash flow, a cash flow valuation, as opposed to a market approach, which is driven around subject company comparables, which is, hey, I sold my company for this EBITDA multiple. My company should be exactly the same or roughly the same. This is going to be much more around building out 2 primary income approach methods that are accepted in NACFA, which is a very strong national organization of evaluators, but it's going to be the capitalization of earnings method and the discounted cash flow method. The capitalization of earnings method is a historical cash flow model that takes 5 years of average cash flows, normalizes those with a capitalization rate that gets created The capitalization rate is a composition of equity risk premiums for a specific industry that are broken down. And those are really where multiples come from, by the way. So in addition to that, we build a model for target working capital. So if you really understand the total valuation, we're not just talking about enterprise value. So when people say I have a 6 times EBITDA multiple, that's enterprise value. But a transaction value is enterprise value plus or minus working capital. So that's your excess working capital over the target working capital number, or deficit working capital at the time of closing, minus the debt the company has. Then you get discounts from there. So you're gonna have an equity value from that number. And then from there, we're gonna apply a discount, say, for lack of marketability. If you sell less than a controlling interest, you're gonna have a discount for a lack of control. So what we're doing in the model, the valuation model, is we're gonna estimate the total transaction value that we're going to be looking at. Now, that we're not gonna close immediately, right? So we're gonna close eventually. We're gonna have to true it up with the balance sheet at the time of closing. So the model is gonna be predictive based on those variables. And I've seen models where they don't even talk about working capital at all. They just have some enterprise value. So I think that's difficult because a lot of middle market companies, smaller companies, very possibly can have a lot of excess working capital, and they don't understand how that actually plays a role in their total valuation. Or how much should I be distributing out, during a transaction cycle? Like, all of those are questions we're going to answer with the model as we go through it.
So once you've gone through that and you've looked at those numbers, then that gives you the tools to move to the feasibility model and see if an ESOP even will work for this business or makes sense for this company.
Yeah, and another way to say that is that the client's in a good position to say, that number works for me or it doesn't work for me, right? And here's the reasons why. And I mean, honestly, it's all over the place too. I find some clients think the number is way higher than it really is. I find other clients that think the number is way lower than it really is. And so you're talking about the reasons why. We're very good at explaining business valuation to companies. So, and sometimes you have people that understand it already, right? A lot of times people don't really, they just understand the multiples. So we are in a good position cost-wise. We've only spent this amount of money, right? Now to move on to the next step, but if it doesn't work on an evaluation, then they don't have to. So it's really a way to kind of keep your costs really low at the front end and not jump into the deeper end and start spending a lot of money on other things. And that's part of the reason this process is developed this way. It's to help companies step into this without jumping into the deep end. And sometimes an ESOP's not going to work, and you don't want to overspend on something that's not going to work.
Yeah.
And I think, to fill in Jim's point, as you get into the valuation and the feasibility, especially, you start seeing soft points in your own accounting software or your own balance sheets and P&Ls that need to be looked at, or why are we doing it this way versus this way? So I think that gives you an opportunity to look at those things and say, are we ready to move forward? Like we did the feasibility study, are we ready to move to the next stage? Or do we need, like to Jim's point, do we need to step back and tighten up these accounting practices or some things that we were doing that may need to take a second look at before we move forward? So I think that period gives that a great opportunity to do that. And look, to be honest with yourself, to realize, hey, either we're ready to move forward or our business is not in the shape we thought it was to move forward. And I think, Phil, you probably see both ways, right? You probably see companies that are like, okay, we're on it, we're ready to move forward. And some companies are like, ooh, you might want to step back for a year, or you might want to step back and get this corrected, and then we can look at it. So
good point.
What are some
of
the...
So one thing.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say along that point too, you might be in the middle of a transaction and, the company starts to have some changes in their interim results. So they could be good changes like, hey, I got way more than I thought I was forecasting, or we actually lost a big contract. So the models will allow us to kind of interpret that data in a real-time basis. So if I have a client who we lost a big contract, how does that really affect our total valuation going into it? That's really important to be able to answer those questions, because we all know business ebbs and flows. As much as we want the forecast to be, right on the money, it's not going to be. It's going to be a good estimate, hopefully, but we have to be able to adjust accordingly. And that's part of the value of the model and going through and then for the client to understand how that impacts them as a tool. is very
And
important.
Phil, remind me, but isn't this also the phase where you're starting to take a hard look at the people that are going to run the company, the executive team, the people that are going to stay, and trying to see are those right pieces in place? You're having discussion with the ESOP consultant, figuring out, those kind of things too, not just financial stuff, but is the team prepared to carry this company to the next thing to accomplish the stuff that it needs to accomplish?
Yeah, what we're going to be running through is specific company risk, which is what Mark's talking about, which are not, it's not always quantifiable. It's really kind of like looking and thinking about what I'm doing with the client in the first step is I'm also playing the role. I'm not doing the work, but I'm playing the role of devil's advocate on asking questions as the independent trustee and valuation firm are going to ask them. So it's going to include things like your management team, and it's going to include things like your composition of customers. I mean, is there concentration issues there? It's going to include a whole host of things. So when we vet out that forecast and we vet out the model, we're not just putting numbers in a box and saying this is the predictive number. We're actually asking questions from a strategic MBA level, which is honestly one of the value points is having a lot of business background, running my own company. I know questions to ask now, and you want to know those risk areas right in the beginning, because sometimes the numbers could say you're worth this, but when you really look at it, I have a client right now, they have 65% of their revenues tied up to one customer. That's a problem, and you can't just say, well, we produce this much revenue and whatever. You have to understand what the implications of those types of things are.
Yeah. We did have a question. So what's the average cost, would you say, to go through all the steps to close?
This is a good question. And let me digress for a second, because the ESOP industry is absolutely all over the place when it comes to ESOP costs. And the reason is because primarily what I do is as an ESOP advisor, I'm playing the role of sell-side advisor. Most of the ESOP deals that are put together are done by investment banking firms in the country. And an investment banking firm is looking at this as just an M&A transaction. So M&A means merger and acquisition transaction. What they're going to get, the way that they get paid is a success fee, primarily, meaning they'll get a percentage of the deal. And that works, in everybody's mind, that works pretty well. I've been pretty explicit on my podcast about this, because I think the problem with that theory is that this is a regulated M&A transaction. So distinctly different, that the Department of Labor has a hand in how transactions are put together. And there's a specific thing called a Department of Labor process agreement that any trustee that's doing this as a buyer definitely needs to follow the process agreement, because if they don't, they are putting themselves at fiduciary risk of overpaying for the valuation. So the process agreement basically says that the trustee can only pay adequate consideration or fair market value for the stock, which basically means that they can't pay a strategic value. And so an M&A transaction contemplates that the investment banking firm is going to get them a strategic value. It doesn't work. So that level of pricing and that way they do these things is actually just doesn't make any sense to me. It never has since I've been doing ESOP work, but it's predominantly the way ESOP deals are done. And so because of that, their costs can be all over the place. So I've seen costs vary in the space between, say, 800 grand, $1 million, $2 million in total costs, right? Which can be totally out of the whack for any smaller company. They can't pay that. Generally, a deal I put together all in with all parties involved, that's including my fee, with attorneys, with trustee, valuation firm, and other attorneys, is going to range around 250 all in. And that's a pretty normal bell curve type of deal. So most people in the ESOP world would tell me that, hey, you're charging way too low for the thing. Well, I'm doing what I believe is ethically correct. And because it's a regulated transaction, that means I can only do so many things to add value. So to answer the question, it is, I would say that's a pretty good ballpark budget, but it can vary widely, and it depends on who you choose, as your advisors.
And I think last time we spoke a little bit about looking at this fee as a percentage of the possible range of the transaction and comparing it to the alternatives that you have if you're a business owner, because you've got M&A, as Philip points out, is is an option. Some people go to a business broker. There are different ways that you might consider transacting a business. For us, it was a significant cash flow issue, but at the end of the day, it was only 2% of the deal. And so I felt that the value was extraordinary for what I was getting vis-a-vis the alternatives.
I am glad Phil said that number, because if he had said a lot less, I'd have been like having to call him after this thing, trying to figure out what the risk. But I would say he's right on. I mean, I think our transaction fees, and even into our first probably 6 months of last year, I think we're under 300,000. I want to say 260 in that range. So he's pretty spot on. I mean, and the good thing about it is because it's so step by step. If you get to the first step and you decide to pause it or not go to the second step, you're just paying for that step. You're not moving forward and paying everything up front. So, if you're not paying for the attorneys until the attorneys need to get involved. You're not paying for the trustee until they need to get involved. So there's a lot of things that the way you break out the cost is a lot better. I sold a business before through a business broker. It was 10% of the deal. So, I was just smart enough to figure out what that 10% was and include it in on the deal. So, but it, like Jim said, for the value of what you're transacting, what you're doing, I don't think you can find something better out there that you're going to spend the money on, to me.
So you mentioned part of the feasibility process and valuation looking at key employees. And so one of the questions we had that came in is, so for Mark and Jim, as you guys would be considered key employees, did you step down from your CEO role before you converted to an ESOP or after? Did you feel like you needed to have that person already in place?
My deal was that and we had a bank who was willing to do 40% of the transaction, but one of their caveats was that I needed to stay on as CEO. To the extent that I wanted a ramp, not a cliff, that was okay. That was okay with me. But it's not uncommon for some portion of the financing to want to encourage the continuation. Now, it depends on who's doing the financing, of course. And that was the bank that I dealt with. It was one of 9 banks. I might encourage prospective owners considering this to shop that around. We did, and we got a huge difference. Philip, I'm sure you've seen that, and Mark, you probably have too. The big difference in the appetite that some financial institutions have versus others. And some of them may not have as much of an appetite if the CEO is expecting to walk out.
Yeah. And I think we talked about this on the last Zoom call. Was it really depends. I started working on this 6 years ago, and it was more of how do I become an absentee owner? It was not how do I sell the business? How do I ESOP? I didn't even know what ESOP was then. I would talk to Jim, and then he would have my eyes glazed over. So I really did not know anything about ESOPs that I should have known. But it really depends on what you're trying to do. I just was putting the pieces in place so I could be away from the business and it ran without. And knock on wood, I was able to do that. So I had a good number 2 that could step in. I moved to the chairman role, so we oversee all the strategic decisions, budget decisions, fiduciary, all those kind of things, and let them run the day to day. And it's worked out well for us. I mean, that's sort of what we had been doing for a couple of years anyway. Our last piece we hired was a CFO, so which pretty much took my responsibilities away. So so it really depends on your business. But it's not and I think that's the takeaway here. It's not an immediate exit ramp, right? You're not going to ESOP a business and step away tomorrow and have nothing to do with the business on some level. Now, it may not be running the day-to-day operations, but you still have to be there. Like the banks are going to want somebody to oversee, the board. You've got a new thing that you didn't have before. A board of directors is a way different way to run a business instead of the old, what the owner says goes kind of thing. So, yeah.
All right. So once you've gone through those two models, then you move on to strategy. Philip, what does this look like, and what does this entail? Is this where you're making decisions on, the kind of ESOP you're gonna go with?
Yeah, it's a little generic in the sense, but let me finish with like the feasibility model. When we finish that, well, let's just say we plan 90% of the whole ESOP plan. I mean, that's what entity like S or C, what percentage of the company we're selling. One of the things that we'll identify in feasibility is what we just talked about, the bank financing and seller notes. And out of the seller notes, one of the questions is going to be, are we going to use warrants on the transaction? So it's going to be, as we tip our toe into the conversation of warrants and SARs, that can be complex for a lot of companies or business owners to kind of like get your head around that. So as we transition into step 3, what we're going to be doing is rounding out the next 10%. So we have a 100% ESOP plan. So the rest of the 10% is to finalize not only the way we've structured the financing, and part of that is to understand the tax benefits of the entity that you choose. So that's going to be in feasibility. What I mean by that, if I'm an S corp, I'm going to be exempt from my company's going to be exempt from paying income tax. So that's going to add a significant amount of cash flow to the equation that we're going to use for how we're going to actually bite off the debt that's going to be created. But one of the parts of that decision is also, if I do a warrant on the transaction, what's happening is my seller is taking a seller note, and that seller note can have a reduced interest rate in exchange for a number of shares of warrants. And when you add those two together, the number of shares of warrants and the interest rate, you're going to have this all-in compensation for the seller as lender to the company for the risk that they're taking on that lender note. And so in ESOP strategy, what we're going to do is we're going to model the warrants out and start to be a little predictive with caveats, like how much would that warrant payment possibly be in the event that these future drivers of value take place. So the warrant will pay out at whatever the valuation is at the time that the seller note is paid off. So that could be in 5 years, 10 years, however we've modeled that out. So what we're trying to do is figure out what is the value of the business going to be worth in the future. So it's a bit of a complicated thing but there's 4 primary drivers to that. It's going to be the forecasted EBITDA, how much cash flow the company's doing going forward. It's going to be the forecasted multiple. It'll be the amount of debt remaining on the balance sheet from the transaction, and it'll be the accumulated cash position of the company. Those are all going to drive the future value. And what's going to happen is there's going to be some expected increase in value from the time we close the transaction to the end. So in step 3, we're going to help at least look at that from a conceptual and a bit of a planning level. The other part of that is to also look at management incentive plan. So we talked about the key people here. One of the things we really need to nail down, in Mark's business, they did a really good job really early on. This wasn't a major issue for us because he had already identified key people. But the main question is, are these people going to stay in the company after the ESOP transaction is booked? We need them to stay, right? So a SAR is a stock appreciation rights program, similar to warrants, synthetic equity, that we're going to model, and we're going to determine like how will that kind of bridge into the total management incentive plan. So that includes their normal annual comp, their bonuses. The SAR is usually a 5-year synthetic equity program that key people can participate in. So in step 3, we're really going to pull that together for education and also for planning, say this is really where we feel like it's going. And then, any final things too, like one of the things I do in my transactions is I try to get the bank nailed down early in this process, as opposed to a lot of deals you'll see in the marketplace, they put the bank at the end. I think that kind of there's a lot of scrambling, and it's a little, to me, it's a little weird because I think it's not just a transaction, it's going to be the relationships the company manages. So in step 3, we're going to do all of those things. And then that's going to bridge us into step 4, which we now know 100% of the deal, the way it's going to look. In step 4, we're going to put together a deal memo that presents that deal back to the client to say, this is what we're talking about doing. It's basically a brief, and it's a memo that we can then take after we get approval, send it out to the trustee marketplace, and start to do our job to start interviewing trustees. So that's going to bring us into step 5. So that's kind of, I'm hitting 3, 4, and 5 kind of together because they are a lot of overlap there.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Another structural option to consider is, and this is perhaps on an expectation that your team, the owner's team and the trustee team, aren't able to come to a precise price negotiation quickly. There is, of course, also an earnout option, which could be considered as a way to bring the two sides together. And the timing of how an earnout works is discretionary, and that's a negotiation in itself. But that's another potential value adder to an owner's ultimate compensation if you can't get to the finish line on valuation straight away.
Let me comment on that too. I think that's great that you brought that up, because it is something that I think it's important to know that that's an option. At least from what I've seen in my deals, the earnout or the clawback, which are two features differently, but they're kind of doing the same thing. They both have this sense of, if we can't get to the number that the shareholder wants to get to, then the trustee basically saying, I don't want to take the transaction, or I don't want to take the financial risk of the company not hitting those projections. So where earnouts and clawbacks come into play is in step 1 and 2, when you're looking at the forecast. If the forecast is going to be really pushing higher, even though there might be a lot of confidence in that than what they have done historically, that is directly driving up the discounted cash flow valuation. Now, the issue there is going to be, if the company doesn't hit it, it's not just that they might have this clawback feature, this earnout structure, which honestly, I'm not saying they're negative at all. They can be what Jim talks about. They can get us over the finish line. But we have to keep in mind that the debt structure that we created in step 2 has to be met. And if those targets fall short, that means our cash flow isn't going to be there to pay off the debt. So one of the main things in step 2, feasibility wise, you've got to nail down the stress test of that cash flow for the company to make sure that they can hit those debt payments. So the earnout is like where I'm saying, I want to get to this number. If I do hit the number, then I'm going to get a purchase price adjustment in the future. That'll increase my purchase price. The clawback says, I'm going to go ahead and get that up front, but if I don't get it, I'm going to have a negative purchase price adjustment. Both of those examples really are predicated upon the assumption that you're going to hit those forecasted targets. The other complication of forecasted targets that are maybe above what you can actually hit or are stretching can be the SAR plan itself can feel a little dilutive to the key people, because now they have these targets that are really hard to get. So if a key person's feeling like, I can't hit these targets anyways, you may lose the momentum of your key management group coming into the unknowns of an ESOP, which I'm going to tell you right now, they're not always going to understand it right off the bat, and it's going to take some time and energy. You want to get them super, positive about the ESOP. And so all of those are things that I think you can talk about in strategy. It's just a matter of understanding really what are the implications of each of these types of potential deal structures. I generally like no deal structure because I think it simplifies the whole thing. And because we have warrants, the shareholder can pick up future value and not feel like they have to squeeze every dollar out at the front end of the deal. So those are just my thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I do remember in our negotiations with the trustee and mine and Phil's strategy meetings, we would talk about, this number, that number, and then how do we get to that number, or how do we get to this number? And we used clawbacks as a negotiating tool, but we didn't have to execute it. So I mean, there's ways to strategize about how to negotiate, use those things as negotiation tools to get, where you want to be anyway. So,
and I think that, Megan, that's the real reason why it's so important to choose your quarterback at the outset. Mark was blessed to meet Philip. I had a similar experience with my quarterback, and I got to know her really well and had a great deal of trust in her and where she could help drive this. So I think that's critical path.
Yeah, and I also think no ESOP deal looks the same, right? So my deal is not the same as Jim's deal. It's not the same as and I feel you can probably attest to that. But they're all different. Every company has its nuances. Every company has is a different ESOP structure, ESOP deal. So, don't think you're going to be cubby holed into one thing, because you're not.
Yeah, it sounds
You're
like
not.
I'm overwhelmed a little bit by just the options, the sheer options that you're talking about. It just seems like there's a lot of ways you can go to make things work for everybody.
Yes.
Well,
I think that's. Go ahead, Jim. Yeah, I was going to just say, we haven't even talked about 1042 at this point. And the one thing I would say about 1042, and again, I think this is just important for me, like from an opinionated standpoint, is that 1042 basically is if I'm a C Corp, I can defer my capital gains tax on the transaction. And I see some advisors saying the S Corp should convert to a C in order to get to the 1042. But the point is that I approach it to be like, hey, that's available as an option, but let's do the pros and cons around that strategy, right? So if I do the S to the C, I lose my exemption for the ESOP for 5 years because I can't convert back to the S till 5 years later, right? And the point is that what I do see that happening, the advice from quarterbacks sometimes is linked to how they can make more money on the transaction. So my advice is ask questions like, number one, how are you getting paid on this? If you're getting a fee as an advisor on not only the transaction success fee, if you're also getting a fee on sourcing financing, if you're also getting a fee on placing the 1042, then I'm going to say that, nothing wrong with making money in America. The point is that you want to get honest, good, objective advice with pros and cons on all the different options. And so because I don't charge for those things, I'm just charging an advisory fee. I feel like I'm in a good objective position to give my client, like, no, this is the pros and cons this direction. This is it this way. And you guys make a decision, but you got to be educated on all that. Instead of, I've seen deals where they're doing the C Corp, they're doing 1042, and it's only because that was the only option presented to them. Like, I'm like, that's the only option that was presented to you. So keep in mind, I think that at the front end is really, really important. I've had people come to me after they work with another advisor, and we literally start over the whole process. As much as I'd love to step into what somebody else is doing, I'm like, I'm not going to do it.
I'm so glad Philip brought that up, because I think there's some soul searching on the owner's part alone to be done even before you start to get advice from your quarterback, and that is this taxation business. We were an S Corp, and we maintained our S Corp status after the transaction purposefully, because I felt as if the successor going forward corporation without the liability of annual income tax as a C corporation had a far greater chance for success on all levels than, and that required that I pay a 20% capital gains. What Philip talks about in a 1042 is I would pay no capital gains. Well, my view was that capital gains at 20% was as low as it's ever been historically, and I wanted the company to be successful. And I thought I could get paid with my owner note, and any other variables in my transaction had a much higher likelihood of being successful if I could unburden my successor corporation from federal income tax.
Yeah, I think it's important as the owner, you're looking at it from two hats, right? You're looking at it from the seller and how it's going to be advantageous to you. But in order to be advantageous to you, it's got to be advantageous to the company, because they've got to take on this new debt and service that debt. And, you go through that in modeling, and when you can put more money towards the service of the debt, it just makes the company much more successful. So I think, there's just, I also stay in an S Corp, and the reasons were exactly the same as Jim. I wanted to see the company succeed. I wanted to see the company be able to service this debt, not have issues, and that's why we moved forward in that direction, because I knew that would be a better chance of success if we did that.
So this is the thing about an ESOP that is a little weird to me. So you get to step 5 where you're hiring people. You're essentially hiring someone that you're going to end up having to negotiate against, right?
Right.
That feels a little weird.
Yep, absolutely. You know, first off, I want to say about step 5 is very, very intentionally and very deliberate. The selling shareholder, even though we're before the whole transaction, is in a fiduciary situation, meaning that they are making a fiduciary decision for the employees of the company on a proposed ESOP plan. So by interviewing the trustees and not just selecting a trustee out of the blue, hey, this is somebody I know, you just believe me, they're good. It provides fiduciary protection for the selling shareholders and their, whoever's on their team to interview them, ask them questions. First off, make sure they even understand your business. Secondly, make sure that they are qualified to be the trustee on a transaction and also on the ongoing basis, because you're not agreeing to that at this point, but you probably most likely will have them as your independent trustee. So this step is so important from just a fiduciary standpoint, but from a deal making standpoint too. You want to know what their thoughts are. So one of the things we do very deliberately is we'll put anything in the deal memo that we believe is maybe a weakness, maybe even a material weakness to the company, and introduce that to the trustee at this stage and say, hey, this is the situation that we have. I got one client right now. They announced the ESOP, they're going to go ESOP, and they're really kind of transparent. They had 2 people leave the company that were in key positions. So we're putting that in the deal memo, and we're going to let the trustee know that's something that we're dealing with. So full disclosure is really important. You also want to get to the point where you really understand, they understand your business, they understand what you're doing, and you understand how they're operating. You're going to ask questions like, hey, how do you guys function as a trustee work group, right? Are you the trustee? Who's your support group? How many clients do you guys have? What's your insurance like? And eventually, what's the cost of their transaction? Ultimately, that puts us in a good position to make a decision on one of the trustees that we interview. And we'll normally interview about 3. Then at that point, they're going to put on their team. So that's include an independent valuation firm, their attorney. And at that point, that's really where I will bring our ESOP attorney into the place. So we've got sell side created and then the buy side from step 5.
And references is so important too. Checking references on these when you're into this hiring process, because there's typically the more experience, the better. And it's pretty easy to find references for people who are trustees or valuation companies or attorneys with experience. But to talk to the actual companies for whom they've worked is, I think, another critical path.
So you hire your people. Who all do you need to hire then exactly?
Okay. Yeah, this is one of Mark and I's first conversations at the NCEO. I remember we were just talking about, you have this big billboard of all these sponsors, and we were like, hey, what does this person do? What does this person do? So really there's primarily on the buy side, there's going to be an independent trustee. That trustee is going to be represented by an independent valuation firm. And then they're also normally going to have an independent ESOP attorney. So that's going to be the buy side. On the sell side, it's going to be a sell side advisor and an ESOP attorney. And usually we'll make sure we include their CPA or other people like that on the sell side. In addition to that, if there's a bank involved, the bank's going to have their own ESOP attorney as well. So as we get closer and closer to putting the whole deal together, those are going to be the functioning teams that all have respective roles. One thing I'll mention on this, I think it's just an important point that I've learned, really just from asking a lot of questions. From a Department of Labor standpoint, and we come back to the idea that this is a regulated transaction, who has the fiduciary responsibility when we talk about the selling shareholders? Well, primarily that falls in the trustee's lap, just so everybody knows. That's why they have insurance and fiduciary insurance. But the board of directors and the selling shareholders also have fiduciary liability. The valuation firm that does that for the trustee has fiduciary responsibility. One of the things that's true about the ESOP world is that the sell-side advisors, like the investment banking firms, there is no jurisdiction for the Department of Labor to go after them if they put a fraudulent deal together. They will only be able to go after the trustee, the independent valuation firm, and the selling shareholders. So the reason I say that is because if you look at ESOP cases that are actual legal problems when ESOPs get created, It's always going to be about the valuation, and they're always going to go after the trustees, and the negative ramifications are going to come back to the selling shareholders ultimately. That's why choosing, and what Jim said is good, choosing those people are really, really important, because at the end of the day, they're the people that are advising on the sell side, they don't really have any risk at all, to be honest with you. And so that's just important to understand. I think sometimes selling shareholders feel like they're like protected there, but they're really not. And so that, just keep that in mind as you're choosing those types of professionals.
So why is a site visit next? Why is that an important thing to do? And who goes on that site visit?
Yeah, really good point. So and again, this could be grouped up to due diligence and other things like that. We could all kind of, now the site visit's very, very important because it gives us an opportunity to tell the story before we provide really all the information on a data room. So what's been happening through steps 1 to 6 is we've been collecting all kinds of files on the company, creating this portal, this data room for the trustee and the valuation firm, for the bank. And so we're going to want to make sure we tell the story of the company before we start releasing all this financial information for the valuation firm. So the site visit itself is going to be, it's really a best practices. So the trustee and the valuation firm really need to go to the company's office just purely to make sure that the company is actually real. So it gives us an opportunity then to present a confidential information memo and really, in a sense, like explain how this whole thing works. And the way we do a site visit is we usually have about a 60 to 80 deck slide presentation that goes through industry overview, company overview, the financial highlights, and then really the ESOP structure. And so some of this on a very, very reduced level is in the deal memo, but this is a very expanded version of that. And like in Mark's case, he did a phenomenal job, but he had like a lot of his key people make a presentation like, this is their department, this is how they do things. This sets us up perfectly to start due diligence so that when they get into the files, they don't have a lot of back and forth questions. I'm not getting a ton of questions from a valuation firm because we've already explained all that. And the way we'll do a presentation is to answer all their questions before they even ask them. Then they go efficiently through the due diligence process, pull the files, put all their stuff together, their models, just like we did in step 1 for the trustee, and we're ready to get right into negotiation.
Okay. So the due diligence is the valuation for the buyers. Correct.
One of the
Jim,
things in the discussion of the hiring team, Megan, when I was interviewing trustees, I had in mind who the size and the people that I wanted on the board, because I wanted to be sure that the trustee would see, any trustee would generally find those people to be acceptable when it came time to ultimately get to the closing, because the trustee is the outfit that designates the ultimate board for the successor organization. And I just wanted to play that out ahead of time with the people I had in mind, so I knew that wouldn't be a roadblock later.
It's a good point.
So here you get to the part that is again the weird part for me, the negotiation. I mean, I guess it's not weird. You negotiate anytime you are buying or selling a business, but but yeah, I mean, how does this work when you've got these, these two sides set up by the same person?
Yeah. A couple of things on this. Go ahead, Mark. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, this was a sticking point for me too, because it was hard for me to understand, hey, I'm negotiating with somebody I hired. But I think the way to understand it is they're doing their valuation and their feasibility modeling through their valuation company. So they come up with their own numbers and their own models and their own where they want to be on price, which we've already done in steps 1 and 2. Now they're doing it just so the trustee has a confidence that, it's been looked at by 2 different groups independently, I guess is the best way to put it. Would you agree with that, Phil? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it comes back to the process agreement, the DOL process agreements. They have to negotiate an arm's length transaction, and the premise is it has to be adequate consideration, which is fair market value. And to get to that black box, like we can't know what they're thinking. We won't provide our valuation model. They won't provide theirs. you will not get to see the valuation report for this first year. Nobody will get to see it, with a few exceptions. So the rule of thumb here too is that there needs to be, again, because it's a Department of Labor regulation, there needs to be optics to the transaction. So that optics word gets thrown around a lot. The optics basically says, hey, we want to show what we offered, and then they want to show what they offered. So you're going to have this seller offer, and then this trustee counter offer. The seller offer, the counter offer. So this is going to be like this back and forth happening. And I go into a lot of detail with new clients on this because it's going to feel a little bit weird. We're not just going to get in a room and, hey, pass your number across the table. We're going to have a term sheet that's going to be very, very descriptive. It's a legal document that's going to have everything under the sun related to negotiation. So, and it doesn't just include purchase price. I mentioned the working capital, the amount of, percentage of warrants, percentage of SARs, the governance. So we talked about the board, that's going to be in there. Indemnifications are going to be in there. So it's going to be pretty much a fully loaded document. And with that, we're going to be aiming on the first offer at everything high, because they're going to be aiming at everything low. And that's going to be for the optics, right? Even though I'm predicting this number and it's usually pretty close to what I predicted, I'm going to start out higher. They're going to come in lower, and then the next turn. Eventually, we get to that net number that everybody agrees to, and so, and that's just part of the process. And it can feel a little weird too for some people, because if I estimate this valuation, why am I starting, say, millions of dollars higher, right? And it's because of that.
Do ESOPs fall apart ever at this point, or can there usually be an agreement?
I would say for my deals, no.
Okay.
The deals I put together, I'm vetting out the trustees and I'm doing a lot of pre-planning work. My expectation, the clients that I have, the expectation is going to be reasonable to what we've predicted. And I'm not trying to get to, I'm not trying to bleed a rock, I guess, in a sense. I'm not trying to push the envelope. I'm sure it can happen and it blows up. I had a deal like when I first started in ESOPs that did blow up at this stage, but the guy's wife had passed away in the middle of negotiations. And so there was a lot of other things happening. We did have a trustee that was a little more, not flexible in the sense of, hey, we need to change our direction. So part of that, you do choose your team wisely when you get down to it, and avoid that. I think that's in my book, that would be a big miss for me, like professionally, if we got to that stage and we weren't able to negotiate it.
Okay. I think that makes sense. So once everyone's decided on a price, it's just down to dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's and signing everything.
Except for just making sure that the next step would be plan design. So the idea is there's going to be some decisions on creating a retirement plan. So the ESOP is a trust, that's a retirement plan. So within that, there's going to be decisions on vesting, eligibility, the way that and the method of allocating shares to employees. So there's going to be some important elements there that either the shareholder or their key people need to kind of think about with the attorney on our side to create the plan, the way they wanted to create it. So there's going to be some choices there. And then, of course, the other stuff, like you mentioned, it'll be just putting a lot of documents together. There are a lot, Mark will say this, there's a lot of documents that you have to go through for the closing. But you just have to kind of page through it and have people help you work through all those types of review points.
Sure. So we have 1 minute left. I would say that if I had one takeaway from this, it's that, you definitely need someone who knows what they're doing, which I know we've said throughout the whole thing, but yeah, it's kind of, it's good to have you guys talk about your quarterback. It sounds like you definitely are going to need someone who knows the ins and outs of all of these things.
Yeah, and my advice was don't be afraid to jump in just because you don't understand some of the lingo and some of the terms and terminology. Jump in, go to an ESOP national convention, go to some regional meetings. Everybody in this realm they get excited about it. They want to teach people about it. They want more participation. They want more companies doing it. And I haven't encountered one person yet that just is down on an ESOP once you get in that little it's a whole little niche community. And once you get in that niche community, that people are just ready to help you. So,
and let's remember that I'm going to run over here. Sorry, Megan, but let's remember that it is in your company's strategic best interest this is my opinion now. We welcome yours, but we want good people who want to come to work for us and stay with us and grow the company and get that sensation that it's theirs. And so that's the whole value now. And I've now seen this since 2016, and it is incredibly heartwarming to see a company run successfully, and what happens to employees' retention and camaraderie and team chemistry and eventual success. So
Well, thank you
that's
guys.
not guaranteed.
Well, like you said, business ebbs and flows. That's the way it goes for everybody. But hey, you guys, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it. Thank you to everyone who joined us and asked questions. July 17th, we will be doing this again. We'll kind of be looking at what does life look like for the business and for the sellers after an ESOP has actually closed. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.